The issue of validity is very significant indeed in research. The reason is that most researchers are trying to make a contribution to knowledge. And it's not just knowledge for themselves, it's actually knowledge that is being made public. Because one of the fundamental criteria for distinguishing research is that it really is systematic inquiry that is made public. And being made public means that it can be subjected to the scrutiny and the criticisms of others to ensure that the claims to knowledge that are being made can stand up to criticism. And in the last century, Karl Popper did stress that importance of being critical in making sure that your claims to knowledge could actually withstand public criticism. Now, in the creation of your own living educational theory, as an explanation of your educational influence, it's really important to make sure that your explanations are as valid as possible. And what I usually do is to advocate two approaches to the issue of validity. Now, the first is a personal one, and it's linked to the work of Michael Polanyi in his work on personal knowledge. Michael Polanyi, and I'll give the references in the section below the video clips on this webpage on Supervision. Michael Polanyi, in his 1959 book on personal knowledge, explains that in relation to personal knowledge, we take a decision to understand the world from our point of view, as an individual claiming originality and exercising our judgment responsibly with universal intent. Polanyi says that we're thrust into the world at our birth, into a world for which we are not responsible, but nevertheless which determines what he calls our calling. Now, this idea of responsibility comes into the idea that you are going to take, as well as I do, a personal responsibility for searching for the truth and actually telling it. Now, this doesn't mean that we've got an absolute notion of truth. It just means that in our search and our inquiry to create valid contributions to knowledge, we have some notions of being truthful, and that we want our explanations to be as valid as possible. Now, the second approach to validity is a social one, and it comes from the work of Jürgen Habermas in a text he wrote in 1976 on communication and the evolution of society. And in this text, Habermas says that there are 4 criteria that we use as we try to reach an understanding together. And I draw on a modification of his 4 criteria as I try to encourage everybody who's constructing their own living theory to create a validation group of peers, and this is usually between 4 to 8 people, who will respond to the explanations that we produce and ask 4 questions of our explanations. And these 4 questions are: how might the researcher improve the comprehensibility of his or her explanation? That is essentially to do with the making sense. Is the account making as much sense as it could do? That is it as comprehensible as it could be? And if not, what would it need to be more comprehensible? The second criteria is one that I think that any empirical or positive researcher would recognise, and I certainly did when I was working myself in relation to a positive research programme I conducted for my master's study in the psychology of education, and that is concerning evidence. That the question is, do we have sufficient evidence to justify the claims that we're making in our explanations? That is the evidence base of our explanation as strong as it could be? And if not, what would it mean for us to strengthen the evidential nature of the explanation we are producing? Now, the third criteria is one that positive researchers don't tend to use and empirical researchers don't tend to use. But nevertheless, it's very important in creating your own living educational theory because it relates to your awareness and the students' awareness of the cultural and the socio-cultural influences that are actually acting on our writings and understandings, and sometimes in a way that we're not actually aware of. These are often taken for granted assumptions in the social context in which we live and work. For example, when I was just assuming that democratic processes of a Western kind were the ones that I was taking for granted. Now, it was actually in supervising students from an Islamic perspective that I began to study an Islamic perspective on educational theory. And it became obvious to me that a Western view of democracy was not one that was actually at the heart of an Islamic perspective on educational theory, because the idea that each individual could participate freely in a democratic decision was actually in contrast to an Islamic perspective where quite a lot of decisions were mediated by the mullahs. And so I had to actually demonstrate that my understanding of democracy and the cultural background which was influencing my understandings came into my writings as a growing awareness. So that's the third criteria, that we should show, as far as possible, our understandings and our awareness of the socio-cultural influences that are actually acting on our writings and explanations. And the fourth criteria, which I do think is one that you'll all appreciate, is to do with authenticity. But it's the idea that in our writings we should show over time and interaction that we are truly committed to the values that we claim to hold. Now, it's very difficult just in one meeting of someone to really be convinced of their authenticity. They may actually be claiming to hold certain values, yet in their practice they may deny them. And I know I've done this myself. And it's only over time and interaction, as the individual shows that they are truly committed to the values they claim to hold, that you can actually justify the claim that the account is actually valid in relation to its authenticity. So in relation to validity, I always stress the individual's responsibility for their own personal knowledge. That comes from the work of Michael Polanyi, that you and I are responsible for the claims that we're actually making. And we have this responsibility to be as truthful as we can in terms of the claims that we make and share. And then the social context and the criteria we use can deal with the comprehensibility, the evidence, the sense of the normative background, and also the authenticity in our explanations. But I must admit that I don't give priority to a democratic process in relation to knowledge creation. I try to use the insights and the criticisms that I get from the processes of enhancing the social validity using validation groups. But I do know that ultimately I rest upon my own personal knowledge in the sense of taking a personal responsibility for justifying my claims to knowledge. And this is what I always emphasize in relation to the creation of living educational theories.